everyone to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking all about the very beginning stages of what it takes to build a startup.
Yeah, really exciting stuff. Trying to unpack what does it actually take to find your footing and build that really sustainable business.
Mm.
And we're drawing from some really awesome conversations we had with Petri Lemoskoski and Risto Radakorpi.
From Gorilla Capital.
Exactly. We also talked to Sampo Parkkinen, who's a serial entrepreneur, and Anna Kilponen, who actually founded Foxy.
Yeah. To give us all a bit of a framework as we kind of navigate this conversation,
Yeah,
we are going to be referencing Howard Love's startup J-curve.
right.
Petri Anami actually mentioned this to us.
Yeah, I think of it as a roadmap of sorts. It's got these 6 phases. It starts with create, which is the business idea.
Mm-hmm.
Then create again, which is MVP development.
So that's your minimum viable product.
Exactly. So the most basic version. Then you've got morph, which is all about pivoting based on that early customer feedback.
That makes sense.
Then you've got model, which is when you define your business model.
Right.
You've got scaling, where you gain customer traction. And then finally, the harvest, which is that profitable, sustainable business. We're not going to break each of these phases down, but it's a useful kind of backdrop as we navigate these initial hurdles.
Absolutely. And, I think for anyone listening who's thinking about launching their own project, or even if you're in a new business and you're trying to understand how it all works, or even if you're thinking about very early stage investing, I think the real question we have to ask for this deep dive is, what are those essential steps and those critical mindset shifts that a startup needs to navigate those initial phases, which can often be so uncertain,
They really are. Yeah, super uncertain.
to eventually achieve product market fit?
Yeah.
So let's jump into it. Something that came up a lot in our conversations was this fundamental concept of understanding customer value.
One thing that Petri made so clear was the customer actually decides what value is. It's not the seller. And what you might think your brilliant idea is worth could be totally different from what customers are actually willing to pay for. And to make it even more nuanced, you have to remember that that perceived value is not the same for every customer.
Absolutely. And he really emphasized how important it is to understand this on a customer-by-customer basis.
Right.
And start to segment your customer base
Hmm.
according to how they see that value.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets really interesting. He said, early-stage companies should be so focused on the customers who offer the highest return on investment. And this is in terms of your time, but also those limited financial resources.
Yeah, you really can't spread yourself too thin. You can't please everyone.
Right from day one.
And this directly ties into the idea of problem-solution fit and ultimately reaching product market fit. It's all about that customer segmentation. And you really start by figuring out, okay, are you solving a real pain point for someone? And then you got to refine it by identifying, okay, which groups actually value that the most? And this leads to your initial ideal customer profile.
Right, your ICP.
Exactly. So your ICP is that specific group of early customers where you think, okay, this is where I can deliver the most value and also where I can get the most valuable feedback in return.
Now, I think it's so important to remember, and Petri really emphasized this,
Yeah.
that those very first people that might take a chance on your idea, the early adopters,
Right.
they might not actually represent your long-term ICP.
Yeah.
And that initial problem solution fit you establish with them might have to evolve
Yeah.
as you really figure out who's your core long-term ideal customer.
Precisely. And I think Anna's experience with Foxy really highlighted this. She talked about how difficult it was to let go of that initial vision that they had for the product and really listen consistently to what those customers were telling them.
Makes sense.
And going back to what Petri was saying, problem solution fit is not this one-time achievement. It needs to adapt for different types of customers, but also for different markets.
Right.
So a solution that's hugely valuable in one market, let's say Finland, might be useless in another, like Germany.
Yeah.
And this could be because of the different needs of the market.
Totally. Or the different alternatives. I mean, there's so many factors.
Exactly, even cultural factors.
So this all sounds good in theory. But how do you actually gauge your progress towards problem solution fit in these very early stages?
It can feel very vague, like Petri was saying, but it really comes down to the founder's ability to articulate the problem they're solving in a way that makes other people believe in the potential of the solution.
Okay.
And this could be customers, investors, advisors, anyone. If the founder themselves can't articulate it clearly, it kind of suggests that it hasn't been validated by the customer yet.
Right. And it doesn't just happen overnight. I mean, it can take months, sometimes years of really refining your understanding.
Exactly. And it's not just about that light bulb moment.
Right, right,
It's about how those customers define and experience the problem themselves.
right. True validation comes from, the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Totally. And that's actually what Petrie said that they look at when they evaluate these early stage startups. He'll just ask the founders, well, which customers have you met?
Mm-hmm.
And then they'll follow up and talk to the customers. And sometimes they find that the customers bought the product for a completely different problem than the founders were intending to solve.
Wow, that is interesting.
Yeah. So the real indicator is whether the founder can articulate the customer's problem, and they're using the customer's language and perspective.
This ties in really well with something that Risto said, which is the paramount importance of learning in the very early days.
Mm. Yeah, he really hit on this idea that early stage startups are like school kids
Right.
and that their primary focus should be on learning. And the metrics at this point should really just support that. They shouldn't be distracting by, focusing on growth and things that really only matter for more mature businesses.
Right. I mean, it's not just passively absorbing information.
No, exactly.
It's about recognizing the learnings and really adapting based on those learnings.
Right. The real progress comes from that active learning. It comes from the founder's ability to say, oh, I thought it worked like this, but it actually works like that. And then using that knowledge to make changes and improve their results. And he said, often the most valuable learnings are the surprising ones because they reveal this new knowledge.
Right. So that you can really make changes and have those better results.
Yeah.
Now, I think to be really open to those surprising learnings, you've got to have a healthy dose of humility as a founder.
Absolutely critical. And humility here means being able to accept that you could be wrong.
Totally.
And being able to truly listen to customer feedback without only picking up the things that confirm what you already believe.
Right, right.
And Risto said that complacency is a real danger
Mm-hmm.
because if you go into a conversation already thinking you have all the answers, you're going to miss out on the feedback that could help you succeed.
So you're out there, you're getting all this customer feedback, and sometimes it can be contradictory or confusing.
It can.
How do you make those course corrections and navigate the pivots that might be required?
Well, Risto has this great guiding principle. He said, take baby steps.
Okay.
Avoid those radical jumps. And he used the analogy of a pivot in dancing. So one foot stays firmly on the ground. And the point is not to change everything at once, because then you're essentially throwing away all your learning.
Yeah. I mean, you're basically starting over at that point.
Totally.
Yeah. It's those small tests and adjustments
Right.
that are informed by the feedback.
Exactly. That are much better than that one massive overhaul.
Now, we've talked about the ideal customer profile, the ICP, a few times.
Yeah.
So for anyone who might not know, we're talking about that very specific type of customer that will get the most value from your product and who you can best serve initially.
Right. And identifying that is a huge challenge for a lot of founders, and it's often because they see it as limiting the market size.
Right.
However, as Risto said, a narrowly defined ICP is actually essential to achieving product market fit. You have to nail the niche before you can scale it effectively.
It's counterintuitive. I think naturally you're like bigger market, bigger opportunity.
Yeah.
But actually in those early days, it's so crucial to really deeply understand that specific target customer.
Mm-hmm.
Because you simply can't effectively serve a huge, diverse customer base.
Right out the gate. Yeah.
Right. When you have such limited resources and your product's unproven.
Totally. And as Risto said, narrowing down initially to that core ICP, it doesn't mean that's your final market. It's just your starting point. So you can always expand later, but you just can't serve a huge market instantly.
Now, I guess the question is there a risk of focusing too narrowly?
And as Risto said, it's actually almost impossible to go too small with your ICP if that definition is based on real customer needs. The bigger risk is trying to reach too many customers at once with this very general, non-specific offering. And he said, when the founder has that aha moment and they really see the core customer group, that's a huge step forward.
Okay. So you're out there learning, you're staying humble, you're making these little adjustments.
Right.
You're getting a clearer picture of your ICP. How do you measure all this progress?
Yeah. What's the role of these metrics and indicators? And Risto was really clear on this. Early on, They're there to help you gauge your learning progress.
Okay.
But then he pointed out that there's this really damaging potential conflict between meeting learning-focused metrics and the expectations of
Oh,
investors.
wow, you were very focused on those growth metrics.
Yes, exactly. Like, is your revenue growing? And that misalignment, he said, can be lethal because it pushes startups to chase these short-term revenue gains, but it's at the expense of building that really important foundation of product market fit.
Right. I think that tension between what founders need to learn and what investors want to see in terms of growth, I think that's a real pressure cooker.
Huge pressure cooker. And as Risto said, there's not often enough discussion happening between the two groups.
Right.
And it's often the investor holding the purse strings who's dictating the focus. And that might not align with where the startup is actually at. And he said, it's interesting that the more experienced founders, the ones who have been through all this, they're the best at defending their focus on early stage learning.
Makes sense.
Whereas first timers might not have the confidence to push back.
Yeah. So what advice did Risto have for founders?
Be proactive. Suggest those indicators that reflect learning and have those open discussions with your investors. And he said, have conviction in your approach. Find investors who align with your vision for this journey.
Absolutely.
And he also cautioned against paralysis by analysis.
Right. Which can be so easy. I think you want to measure everything, but
Yeah.
you have to just focus.
You do. He said, pick 2 or 3 indicators that reflect your learning and your progress right now,
Right.
and then be brave enough to say no to those distractions.
Now, I'm curious, what kind of indicators did they find particularly insightful at Gorilla Capital?
He said one of the things they look for in monthly reports is new customer insights.
Okay.
Because this shows that the startup's really engaging and they're able to extract meaningful information from those interactions.
Right.
And then obviously from a financial standpoint, runway is crucial.
That makes sense.
So having enough cash to keep the lights on, because reaching product market fit, it takes time.
Often multiple funding rounds.
Exactly. And another acid test is, how precise can the founder articulate their ideal customer profile?
Right.
That really shows their understanding and maturity. And then there's the basic activity metrics,
Right.
like how many customer interactions are you having?
And beyond just acquiring those new customers, what else should you be monitoring?
It's super important to understand how those customers are using your product and how sticky it is.
Right.
So their retention rate.
So you need both that acquisition and retention.
Exactly. A sustainable business has both. And Risto said one of the biggest mistakes is premature scaling,
Right.
applying growth-focused metrics and strategies that are only appropriate for those mature businesses.
Too early.
Too early. Exactly.
And Anna's experience with Foxy really brought this danger of scaling prematurely to life.
It did. She was talking about how they faced all this pressure to scale rapidly, even before they had reached problem solution fit.
Right.
And it resulted in high churn because those customers weren't happy. And they also had the struggle, which we talked about earlier, of letting go of their initial concept and listening to what their customers were saying. And I think it just perfectly illustrates how important it is to have that narrow market focus
Right.
and the well-defined ICP.
So to be clear, you're not saying don't expand later.
Not at all. But that initial focus is absolutely crucial.
So where does this pressure to scale so quickly come from?
Anna talked about a couple sources. She said sometimes it's external advisors who are used to those later stage companies.
Right.
Sometimes it's the allure of being a unicorn.
I can see that being very tempting.
Oh, yeah. Huge. And sometimes even investors who don't understand those fundamental differences
Right.
between those pre and post product market fit stages.
Right. And it's not to say that those things aren't important. It's just there's a right time.
Yeah. And as Anna said, trying to do the right things at the wrong time leads to poor outcomes. That initial focus has to be on problem solution fit, which then leads to product market fit.
So what are some of the signs that you're starting to move towards product market fit?
Anna had some great points. She said, demo meetings start to become easier
Okay.
because you have this really clear and consistent pitch. Customers start offering valuable feedback, and they keep using the product even if it's still in this early imperfect state.
Right.
And you see these trends in the metrics,
Mm-hmm.
like the conversion from demo to trial,
Right.
trial to paying customer. And even more importantly, the customer is expressing disappointment if the product were to disappear.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah. So, Sampo echoed this. He said, you'll know because the customers will start coming to you.
Right.
Or your outbound efforts will lead to these amazing sales. And you'll be so busy that you won't even have time to announce publicly that you've hit product market fit.
And Sampo is really strong on when you should build your sales team.
Yes. And Anna agreed with this. He said, you have to remember a startup isn't just a mini corporation. And so those principles that apply to big companies often don't apply to these early stages.
Right.
So hiring salespeople before you've achieved product market fit.
Before you've proven that growth pattern.
Exactly. Can be a huge waste of time and money.
Mm.
And his advice was clear. Hire the sales team after you've definitively achieved product market fit. Before that, the focus should be on getting there through customer learning and adaptation.
Yeah.
And you want to do that with as little capital expenditure as possible.
So let's talk about this learning process.
Okay.
Because Aiku, from implicitly refers to the company Aku works for, had some really interesting insights on how their team prioritizes learning from their customers.
What I found fascinating is they actually formalize it.
Yep.
They have this dedicated time every week for learning discussions.
Yeah.
And they always start with the very latest feedback that they've received.
That's smart.
Right.
That's a really good way to stay grounded and focused.
Absolutely.
But how do you even sift through all that feedback?
Exactly, because customers can say a lot of different things.
Right. They'll have a lot of desires and suggestions. How do you decide what's a need versus a want?
And Aku said that those internal team discussions, especially with his co-founder, were crucial to making those distinctions.
Right. Yeah.
And he gave a really interesting example where they had these customers asking for a specific new feature, but they were actually asking for conflicting things.
Right. Okay.
And so it highlighted how you can't satisfy every wish,
Right.
but that taking that time to think critically and logically reason as a team, it helped them identify what would provide the most value.
So how has their ideal customer profile evolved?
That's interesting. He said their ICP has remained surprisingly consistent.
Okay.
So they were always focused on large retail companies.
Right.
And that core has remained, but their understanding of the nuances has deepened.
Makes sense.
So, for example, they realized the technical capabilities of the customer really impacts who their ideal customer is. And they've decided to keep a narrow focus. So, they got some inquiries about B2B surveys, but they haven't gone there.
Right.
And they think that narrow focus is going to be even more important when they start thinking about international expansion.
Mm-hmm. Now, Aku also told us about a time when they hired a salesperson too early.
Yes. And I think it really highlights that danger of premature scaling.
Absolutely.
And he felt that it wasn't the salesperson's fault, but rather that the company wasn't ready for that.
Right.
And he also talked about how important their product development was to their progress. So they were initially relying on a consulting company, but they realized they needed in-house expertise.
Right.
So they hired a developer full-time. And this was particularly important because neither of the founders were technical.
Right.
And they had these limited resources, which actually forced them to focus on core features.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to that whole, get that MVP out there.
Yeah, exactly. You want to go with the core features first.
Right.
And I think it ties into this idea of, getting the loop going faster.
Right, that iteration.
Yeah, both in sales and product development.
Right.
So they were experimenting with different methods. For example, they tried email campaigns, which weren't that effective. And it made them realize, the founder's time is so crucial for driving that evolution of the strategy.
Right.
And he made a really good point. He said limited resources can be a blessing in disguise because it forces you to prioritize.
You have to earn the right to advance.
You do. And even managing the development team required a lot of learning and adaptation as the company was growing.
That makes sense. I mean, it's a constant evolution. And Sampo was really passionate about learning from your customer.
He said that's the only thing that matters in the pre-product market fit phase.
Right. Forget everything else.
Forget culture, forget HR, forget marketing, branding, everything.
Just focus on that customer.
And he said that learning is a bottom-up process. You need to understand specific customers and sometimes understand their behaviors even better than they understand them.
That's fascinating.
It is. And he was very adamant that you can't outsource this.
Right. You can't just give it to someone else.
Market studies, they can give you some context, but they won't help you reach product market fit. You have to engage with those customers directly. And he said, the conversation with the customer is unscripted. You don't know what questions you'll end up asking.
Right, right. You're going in there to learn.
Exactly. And he just said, get out the door.
Go talk to the customer.
Yeah, go talk to them. That's where the learning happens, not just analyzing data.
So let's come back to product market fit.
Yeah.
What exactly is it?
Right. We've been dancing around it.
Right. We've heard all these hints.
Yeah.
So what is it?
Well, Anna described it as, It's when demo meetings become easy because you have that consistent sales pitch. Sampo said it's when the customers start coming to you or your outbound efforts lead to really high engagement in sales. And he even said, you might be so busy that you won't have time to announce it.
And I think what's also interesting is, you might achieve it for one segment
Right.
and then assume you have it for everyone, but it doesn't necessarily work like that.
You can't just scale immediately across segments. That can actually lead to excessive dilution.
So what's a real difference in terms of risk and stability?
Sampo put it bluntly, pre-product market fit. Your startup is at risk of dying.
Wow. Okay.
Post-product market fit, there are still risks, but they're more about things that could slow you down, not that you're going to fail completely.
This whole journey, it sounds like it demands a lot of resources, especially money.
It does.
So what role does money actually play in this learning phase?
Sampo actually argued that money doesn't necessarily help you learn faster, and it can even be a distraction.
Really?
It can, because it can make founders pursue all these irrelevant activities. He said, it's not about having a huge budget. It's about those customer conversations. And he even suggested that spending less money could be better.
So counterintuitive.
It is, because it forces you to be resourceful and focus on what matters, the customer.
Right. I think people tend to think that the more funding, the better the progress, the more the likelihood of success.
But Sampo said, you might find very creative ways to spend money that don't actually contribute to learning about the customer.
So early stage founders, they get bombarded with advice, especially from investors.
Yeah, they've seen it all. How should founders navigate this?
Exactly.
Sampo had this idea that most investor advice is wrongly timed.
Okay.
Not wrong in itself, but just given at the wrong time.
Right, right.
He said context is everything.
Makes sense.
And something that might be relevant for a large company could be harmful to an early stage one. And he said, VCs love giving advice, but it often lacks context.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to cut through that noise.
Especially when it's coming from these really experienced people.
Exactly. So Sampo said you have to learn to distinguish between the advice that's relevant to your current stage.
Right, which should be all about that customer learning.
Exactly. And advice that's for later stages.
So learning to identify the timing of the advice is really important. Now, what about building the team and the culture in those early days?
Sampo was pretty pragmatic about it. He said, pre-product market fit.
Yeah.
4 to 5 people is enough. Don't overemphasize culture yet.
Okay.
And if you're struggling with alignment, it might be that you have the wrong people, not that your culture's bad.
So this whole process sounds like it takes a long time.
It does. Building a significant company is a marathon, not a sprint. And Risto actually said it often takes 5 to 10 years or more.
Wow.
He talked about one of their portfolio companies that was celebrating its 10th anniversary. And he said resilience is so crucial for founders because you're going to have to weather the ups and downs.
Absolutely.
Don't give up too easily, but also recognize when it might be necessary to pivot or even shut down.
And I think that humility is key to be able to accept the setbacks.
Totally. To learn from your mistakes and keep moving forward.
So as an investor, what qualities do you look for in early stage founders?
Risto said, early on, it's all about the people.
Right, because that model's probably going to change.
It will. So they're investing in the founders.
Right.
And they try to sense that curiosity and resilience, but he did admit it can be subjective.
Right.
And he said, most of their no decisions aren't about the founder.
Okay.
It's about the strategic fit.
Makes sense.
And he emphasized that philosophical alignment between the founders and the investors is so critical. He said, it's like choosing a life partner. You're going to face challenges together.
Do you need that trust?
Yeah.
Now, I know we're just talking about the beginning of the journey, but Risto did touch on the exit for investors.
He did. And he said, if you take VC money,
Yeah.
there's an implied promise of an exit. He did say, not all businesses are like that.
Right.
Revenue-funded lifestyle businesses, those are valid.
Totally.
But if you are seeking venture funding, you got to think about that exit. But don't focus on it too early.
Right, right. So for our listeners, let's distill some takeaways.
Yeah.
So the journey to product market fit is all about learning.
Mm.
And it's about engaging with your customers. And it's so important to know the difference between what they say they want versus what they need.
Mm-hmm.
And your focus should be on solving a problem for that very specific group, that ICP.
Mm-hmm.
And resist that urge to scale too soon.
Too soon. Yes.
You have to validate your value proposition first.
Exactly.
And then you can start thinking about rapid growth.
And remember to stay humble. Embrace learning from that customer feedback, even when it's not what you want to hear.
Absolutely.
And be willing to adapt your vision. Seek advice, but filter it through your current stage.
Hmm.
And remember to build that foundation of customer understanding before you optimize for growth.
I have a question for you, listener.
Oh, okay.
As you're thinking about all this, think about a time when you made assumptions about what others needed,
Okay.
or when you had a hard time staying focused because there was just so much advice flying at you,
Right.
or even the tension between your long-term goals and what you have to do right now.
Mm-hmm.
How would a learning first approach, where you really prioritize understanding your customers,
Right.
how would that change your perspective in that situation?
And we encourage you to revisit those core concepts: the startup J curve,
Mm-hmm.
problem solution fit,
Yeah.
product market fit. Think about your experiences through this lens. There's always something new to learn
Absolutely,
about
yeah.
building something new.
That's it for today's deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See ya.